All right, let's dive into a real historical detective story. It's one of those cases where our whole understanding of an ancient civilization, a theory that's been in the textbooks for over 100 years, pretty much hinges on a single question about one specific animal. Yep, for more than a century, this one animal has been held up as the key piece of evidence, almost like the smoking gun in a story about migration, conquest, and the very roots of Indian culture. Its presence, or more importantly, its supposed absence, was used to build one of the biggest theories about the ancient world.
And that animal is the horse. So today we're going to dig into some source material that puts this whole horse question under the microscope and asks a pretty simple question. Does this crucial piece of evidence actually hold up?
So let's get right into it. To really get why this one animal carries so much historical weight, we've got to first understand the massive theory that's basically been built on its back. This is the classic Aryan Migration Theory, or AMT. The nutshell version goes like this. Around 1500 BCE, groups of Indo-European speakers swept down from the Central Asian steppes into the Indian subcontinent, and they supposedly brought a revolutionary new toolkit with them: the Sanskrit language, the fast-spoked wheel chariot, which was a game-changer in warfare, and, of course, the engine that made it all possible, the domesticated horse. Okay, so what's the proof for this big theory? Well, here's where it gets really interesting. A key pillar of the whole argument has always been a lack of evidence, something historians have called the equine silence. The logic is pretty straightforward, right? For the horse to be a foreign import brought in by migrants, it must have been totally absent from India before they arrived. This idea, this supposed absence, is the absolute linchpin. The entire argument rests on it. And for decades, this has been the standard line. The great Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappans, didn't have horses before 1500 BCE. The proof? An apparent lack of horse bones in the archaeological digs. This was presented as definitive proof of this equine silence. But the source material we're looking at today challenges that idea head-on. It asks, what if that silence isn't really silent? What if we've just not been listening closely enough? Let's dig into the archaeological record it lays out. And wow, this slide is basically a direct challenge to that whole idea of absence. The source points to a ton of horse remains found in India that are dated way before 1500 BCE. We're not talking a few decades earlier. Look at Bagwar, 4500 BCE. That's 3,000 years before the supposed migration. And get this, at Surkhatata, they found bones of the true horse, Equus caballus, in all the different layers of the dig. And it's not just bones. The source also points to art. For instance, a small horse figurine was identified at Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most famous Indus Valley cities, by one of the guys who first dug it up. And here's another great example from Lothal, a huge port city for the Harappans. They dug up several of these little terracotta horse figurines. I mean, think about it. You generally don't make models of animals you've never seen before. It strongly suggests the horse was a familiar animal in their world. The evidence presented goes back even further, like way further. The source points to rock art at a site called Bhimbetka. Some of the paintings there show horses and riders, and researchers have dated them as far back as a mind-boggling 10,000 years ago. Okay, so this raises a fair question. If horses were there, why are their bones so rare compared to, say, cattle bones? Well, this quote from archaeologist S.P. Gupta gives a really common-sense answer. Rarity doesn't mean absence. You don't find a lot of camel or elephant bones either, and we know for a fact they were there. Why? Because these were valuable working animals, not your average Tuesday night dinner. But the case doesn't just stop with stuff they dug out of the ground. The source material keeps building its argument by looking at clues from ancient texts, from linguistics, and even from genetics. Now, this is just fascinating. The source highlights a super specific detail from the ancient Vedic texts. The Rigveda describes a sacrificial horse as having 34 ribs. But the Central Asian steppe horse, the one that was supposedly brought into India, almost always has 36 ribs. That's a pretty big anatomical difference. It strongly suggests the Vedic horse might have been a totally different, maybe even a native breed. The language picture is also way more complicated than you'd think. Our source points out that while Sanskrit has its word aśva, the Dravidian languages in southern India have their own ancient words for horse that are completely unrelated. Now, if the horse was just introduced by one group, you wouldn't expect that.
It points to different cultures having their own separate, long histories with the animal. And then you have the DNA. The source argues that fossil records point to a native Indian horse species, Equus civilensis, as being in the family tree of the modern horse. And this fits with what broader DNA studies are telling us, that the horse wasn't just domesticated once on the steppes and then shipped out. It likely happened in multiple places. All of this really complicates that simple one-way migration story. And finally, the source brings in a totally different perspective, a symbolic one. It quotes the philosopher Sri Aurobindo, who argued that the word aśva in the ancient Vedas didn't always mean a literal physical horse. It could also be a symbol for energy, speed, or a kind of vital force. And if that's true, it could explain why the horse is mentioned so often in religious texts, even if the actual animal wasn't all that common. So, what happens when you put all of these pieces together? The bones, the art, the words, the genes? Well, according to our source material, that so-called equine silence completely disappears, and a very different story of ancient India starts to take shape. Let's just do a quick recap of this counter-narrative. First, archaeology breaks the silence. Second, the horse in the ancient texts doesn't even match the supposed imported horse. Third, genetics points to a native Indian horse lineage. And fourth, the words and symbols hint at a story that's much deeper and more complicated. So the bottom line from our source material is this. You don't actually need a big, dramatic migration event to explain the horse in ancient India. A much more plausible story is one of slow, steady interaction over centuries. Things like trade, local domestication, and complex cultural exchange. It paints a much more nuanced and maybe more realistic picture of the ancient world. And that leaves us with a really powerful final thought. The horse was supposed to be the smoking gun, the definitive proof for a massive theory of migration and conquest. But if that evidence crumbles, if the silence is actually broken, it forces us to ask what other parts of that old foundational story might be ready for a complete rewrite.